Good morning and welcome to the third plenary session of the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Please welcome our host for this morning, Professor Tim Plenary, and the distinguished panel.
Well, welcome everyone to what I'm sure is going to be a very exciting day. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet, the Turrbal, Jagera and Yugara peoples, and to pay our respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Indigenous cultures in the Asia-Pacific region. The Australian Prime Minister's announced that today is a national day of mourning in relation to the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. To acknowledge the life and services of the Queen, there'll be a 1-minute silence held at 11 a.m. today. Reducing disaster risk and building resilience in communities isn't a fixed goal. It's really an ongoing process. And communities need to continually adapt as the hazards they face change over time. This plenary will focus on two key principles to reduce disaster risk: inclusion and localised approaches. Disaster risks are community and context specific. People-centred, inclusive and accessible approaches are essential to building community resilience. People who are economically, socially, spatially or politically excluded due to factors such as gender, age, disability, indigeneity, locality and socio-economic status, face far greater risk, disaster risk, and are often more adversely impacted by disasters. Such people are less likely to have access to the right information, resources, community connections, networks and institutions, which may reduce their risk and assist in their recovery. At the same time, when people are excluded from participating and making decisions to build resilience of their community, we miss their specific expertise, skills, knowledge and experience. Local communities are always the first and last responders to disasters, and local decision making plays a critical role in reducing disaster risk. Communities recover faster when community-based approaches are practiced that build on local capacities. To reduce disaster risk and build resilience, there's a need to better link community-level and government-led planning, evidence, investment, capacity building, decision-making and communication, as well as initiatives occurring in the private sector, academia and civil society. Localised approaches acknowledge that while governments and various stakeholders play a role in providing information to strengthen local decision-making, communities themselves are the primary drivers and generators of community resilience. We hope you'll come away from this morning's session with a greater appreciation of the need for diversity in disaster risk reduction, decision-making and what you can do to change that in your workplace, as well as some key recommendations to support policymakers in accelerating the implementation of the Sendai framework in the Asia-Pacific at the local level. We'll now play a short introductory video on this topic.
Merong realization na part pala kami ng society. That we are not just, na hindi kami maging burden ng society, but isang contributory for the development.
Disasters don't discriminate, but the decisions that we make do. Women, children and youth, persons living with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, older people, migrants and gender minorities bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to disaster risk reduction. We all benefit when they have a say in the decisions that affect us all. Inclusive leadership draws on diversity, local, traditional and Indigenous knowledge and experiences, because the resilience of any nation is dependent on the resilience of its communities. To reduce risk and build resilience, communities, governments and all stakeholders need to work together. Investment, resources and capacity development are needed at the local level to build resilience. We need diverse and inclusive, meaningful participation in decision-making. Local communities are always the first and last responders. They are at the front lines of prevention and resilience efforts. By prioritising a gender-responsive, disability-inclusive and human rights-based approach to disaster risk reduction, we can reduce disaster risk for all.
I'd now like to introduce our illustrious panel. On my left in the screen is Rosemary KS. She's an internationally recognised human rights lawyer in the area of disability. She is chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Rosemary also teaches international human rights law at the University of New South Wales, and she's joining us online. And moving left, we have Ricardo Mena, who is the Director of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva. Ricardo has served in the United Nations in various capacities and duty stations for the past 27 years and has experience in all facets of disaster risk reduction, and it's linked with sustainable development, climate change and humanitarian crises. We next have Nolene Nabulivo, who is a feminist community organiser, analyst, educator and activist working for socio-economic, ecological and climate justice and universal human rights in Fiji, the Pacific and globally over the last 35 years. Nolene is the Executive Director of Diverse Voices and Action for Equality and holds many social movement roles. And finally, we have Sudirman Said, who is Secretary-General of the Indonesian Red Cross. He's held a number of leadership positions in the public and private sector, as well as not-for-profit organisations. Sudirman has served as the Indonesian Minister for Energy and Mineral Resources and was Deputy Chairman of the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Agency for Aceh and Nias following the 2004 tsunami. As with other plenary sessions, we'll have pre-identified questions that will be asked from the audience and the panel will respond to these. These questions have been selected from a number that have been shared in the lead up to the conference by delegates. This plenary has had a large number of questions, so sadly we'll only be able to cover a small section of them today, but I think they've been chosen to give you a broad sampling of what's been asked. So, to turn to question one, I'd now like to call on Amanda Aridi, Acting National Operations Manager of Emergency Services at the Australian Red Cross, to ask the first question.
Thank you. What knowledge, skills and experience do government, business and civil societies need to ensure diverse voices are included in decision-making about risk? Thank you.
Great. Did you all hear the question? Great, all right. Nolene, perhaps you'd like to start with responding to the question.
Thank you. I'm going to use my notes as well, because otherwise I could talk on this forever. One of the first things to say is that we really have to do more thinking about thinking and auto-critique ourselves and the people with whom we work every day on gender, on human rights, on climate change, and on disaster risk and reduction and response. One of the things that I think we have to do is use these things that we've built over decades. So for the feminist movement, for instance, intersectional frames that look at us in all our identities. All of us have multiple identities that we live with every day. I might be a mother, a daughter, a lesbian, a woman who lives in a city or a rural area, and all of those things matter in the way that I deal with crises and disasters. Interlinkage frames are also incredibly important because they allow people to come in from many different angles. If you're someone who's working in your particular community on health or sexual and reproductive health and rights, there are ways that you can still feed in. If you're working on disability rights as your core issue, many issues, but we need all of us to be able to link in. So, and seeing that as a technical skill, as a very important set of skills. Building all of our knowledge on how to substantively incorporate gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics and human rights into all of our DRR and climate change work, doing power analysis, being able to look at issues of privilege and oppression, because whatever our DRR response is, it is a mirror of our society, so obviously we have to pay close attention to that. And I'd say, I really would ask people to maybe think about stopping saying disasters don't discriminate, because actually it's not true, they do. They're worse for anyone who already faces structural inequalities. So the data tells us that women and children, for instance, are 14 times more likely to die in disasters. The Pacific, for instance, has some of the highest rates of violence against women and girls in the world. And these are much worse during disasters. If you look at one particular disaster in the Pacific, the rates of reported gender-based violence went up by 300% in the first 3 months after the disaster. But also two more things that help us to kind of think about different ways that disasters do discriminate, and the response is discriminatory, is that there's 50% unmet contraceptive and sexual and reproductive health and rights needs of women in the Pacific, for instance. And of course, any time that a community is under stress and those commodities are not available, that increases the amount of kind of strain on women and girls. We also have the lowest rates of women in formal legislative bodies in the world, and this is linked to gendered social norms that are stubbornly patriarchal, and they're protected by many, and we're trying to change that. And the ILO tells us clearly that women do 76% of the unpaid care, domestic and communal work in our communities. So if your bodies are broken, if you're exhausted, then it's very, very tough for you to respond like anyone else to a disaster. So really, let's put that back into the equation and talk about it openly and critically. Thank you.
Well done. Thanks, Nolene. That was great. Ricardo, would you like to add anything to Nolene's response?
Yeah, but very difficult to compete with Nolene's eloquence.
Yeah.
But you know, I would say many things along the lines of what you have said, Nolene. There are compelling evidence of benefits of diverse leadership in decision making. And there are interesting studies, for example, in the private sector. There is greater profitability when higher representation of women in chief executive officers' positions exist. And diversity brings, of course, much greater depth and breadth of experience and perspectives. And this is fundamental to building resilience. I was really impressed last night when we had the WIN DRR, the Women International Network on DRR event, and saw the depth and the diversity and the experience and the knowledge that women leaders are bringing in the Asia region on the area of disaster risk reduction. And we know, as Nolene said, risk is something that it's experienced very uniformly. Informally, sorry. Poor people, for example, in developing countries face many times more probability of dying of the disaster than people in developed nations. And people facing particular conditions of vulnerability also suffer disproportionately, and this includes persons with disabilities, women, children, indigenous people, older people, and of course the poorest. They have less access to resources and opportunities. And no one understands these challenges better than people that live with this high exposure to risk. So when women and persons with disabilities and these other groups that face these conditions participate in leading DRR initiatives, we all benefit. And you know, on our flagship publication, the Global Assessment Report 2022, we have said it very clearly. Nothing should be done for us without us, meaning if emergency services, if disaster risk reduction measures are taken without the participation of this broad participation of people in society, then we are really failing to what we are mandated to do. And the Sendai framework outlines very clearly an inclusive and all-of-society approach that is needed to reduce risk and recognize the indispensable role of stakeholders in building resilience. We heard yesterday the main responsibility for disaster risk reduction lies with governments, but governments cannot do it by themselves. They need the participation of the whole of society approach and stakeholders in supporting these efforts. And use of traditional knowledge is another very important aspect. Thousands of years of cumulative experience and knowledge need to be put also in the mix to make disaster risk reduction better and more adjusted and accommodated to the context and the actual needs of people. So this is perhaps what I would like to add and end with this notion that we have the knowledge, the skills and the experience we need, but we need to create the space to learn from and benefit from the knowledge, skills and experience of others.
Great. Thanks so much, Ricardo. Now, I'd like to turn to our second question, which will be asked by Octavi Andaresta, who is Disaster Analyst at the National Disaster Management Authority of Indonesia.
Thank you. In dealing with systemic risk, the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction 2022 has recognized that human minds are prone to biases and tend to have short-term memories in decision-making. Therefore, to what extent can we be confident that local wisdom and traditional knowledge are still relevant to address today's risks?
Perhaps, Rosemary, you could jump in with this question.
I just want to check that I've actually got the question correct. So we are all human and we all have failings, and so the question is whether Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge is still relevant for how we understand disasters now and the risk that we confront. I think any knowledge can be a powerful thing. Indigenous knowledge is important in understanding various ways in which disaster has been approached previously. I mean, the experience here in Australia with the significant bushfires that we had, there was lots of debate about why we haven't learnt from the Indigenous owners of Australia and be able to prepare a lot better for what we know is the cyclical and increasing events of fire. But in terms of human rights and my role on the committee, we should be open to communicating and being able to listen to all voices that need to come forward to be able to inform how we respond to disaster risks. And we saw this with COVID. We need to be able to have the voices of people who are going to be affected by these situations heard loudly and very clearly. With COVID, it was highly evident that if those voices weren't accepted as expertise in that area, then people with disabilities were at heightened risk to get the disease and then pass it on. And so you're not only putting that cohort group at risk, you're putting the whole community at risk. So if one group is not safe, the whole community is not safe. And so I think if we recognise the expertise of the lived experience of people with disability, and that goes for any any representative group. As Nolene said, we all are a collection of complex, multiple layers of identities, and those identities will have a more prominent role in any given situation. And so the expertise of people needs to be respected, because if we can't accept that expertise, then we're leaving all of ourselves vulnerable to the risks that we confront.
Great. Thanks so much, Rosemary. That's fantastic. I was wondering if Sudirman, you would have anything to add to the response.
Thank you, Tim, Professor Tim. Thank you for the question. So in terms of local wisdom, multicultural archipelago like Indonesia has more than 300 ethnics with the vast knowledge and disaster reduction. I would like to specifically mention here the experience of the Simeulue people who live in a remote small island in Hindia Sea, Sumatra. When the 2004 tsunami hit Aceh with devastating loss of human lives, economics, and infrastructure, the human casualties in the island of Simeulue is not that high. This is due to the extraordinary local tradition called Nandong Smong. That is very, very local wisdom. This beautiful lullaby that traditionally passed down to the generation is a form of soft voice, singing technique, humming and set of song to entertain yourself or to help put baby to sleep, save 100,000 of lives when the earthquake and tsunami hit in December 2004. Many parts of humming and song lyrics consist of advices and direction how people to deal with disastrous event. Thus, through Nandong Smong, the ancestor of Simeulue teach the younger generation the knowledge, the symptom, and the sign of coming disaster, specifically earthquake, sea level rise, and tsunami. It is also consists of information how they deal with the running and seek shelter in the higher ground, in the hill, in terms of sea level rise and tsunami. I found this wisdom when I served as part of the leadership team at Aceh Reconstruction Agency. The knowledge of Nandong Smong provides us the clear and comprehensive idea in developing the capacity of every local government in Indonesia to establish evacuation plan, dedicated ensemble area, and safe route in disaster event. In addition to that, for example, the eruption of one of the most actively volcano in the world, the Mount Merapi in Central Java, we are in Indonesian Red Cross learn from what happened in Aceh. Therefore, our preparedness is better when we establish evacuation plan when was alerted by local government and local community. To sum up, Indonesia Red Cross established its disaster risk reduction based on the community knowledge in accordance with community know-base. For that reason, the majority of Red Cross volunteers are stationed at the district, sub-district, and village levels. From that experience, we believe that local wisdom and traditional knowledge as resourceful source of knowledge for disaster management.
Great. Terima kasih banyak, Sudirman. That's wonderful. It's so heartening to hear that those real community lessons are being taken heed of in Indonesia. I think they're just so important. So thank you. Look, for our third question, I'd like to now call on Claire Giubellini, who is Vice President of People with Disabilities Australia, to ask a question.
Thank you. Community can sometimes be a vague term. Within some societies and local communities, there are marginalised people who live with exclusion and discrimination every day. For example, in many areas of the world, people from the LGBTQIA+ community do not live safely amongst their community. How can we all ensure that people who experience exclusion and the dual barriers of disability and lack of freedom of sexual expression are receiving equitable access to information and support during times of disaster and in the preparation and planning for recovery? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Nolene, perhaps you might lead off for us on this one.
We have these incredible opportunities now to do work on issues like universal human rights, and so GSEC, you know, thinking and talking about, and on rights of peoples with disabilities, and many, many other issues. And one of the things that we talk about in the room and trying to make it real and connect with people is to say, you are all ginger flowers, and you all, you know what, the ginger flower has so many different parts to it, and if you only concentrate on 1 or 2 or 3 parts and you don't see the whole flower, then it really does have an impact on how you communicate and how you are in relationship with another human being. And it's not a trite thing to say, but it's that often what happens in disaster risk and response is we are most comfortable with the ones that we feel are like us. And one of the things that we have to do is to build the ties and the networks for the results and for the beloved community, and not for our own personal value systems. And I think we've got to think a lot more about that. It's not just about nurturing existing relationships, who we can work with as government, individual workers, or civil society, or public sector. It's not just about kinship ties. We talk a lot about kinship ties and how strong we have our relationships in community in the Pacific, and that's incredibly important. But it's also about things like peer systems and about women-led groups at very localized levels. It's about young people leading things, not just us doing things for young people, but youth-led sets of work, and faith-based and sporting ties that we might have. And I think that we've found very much in terms of COVID-19 and in all of the disaster risk reduction sets of work in the region. We have Sharon Bhagwan Rolls and others and many, many movements, including Shifting the Power Coalition and others, that what it is about mutual aid relationships and building those relationships over time, and making sure that those are already in place so that when the disasters hit, there are many, many more sets of relationships that you can have around you. I mean, one of the things that we found very useful in the last few years is being able to have high-level relationships with people that we can ring within police, for instance, or within the NDMO, or making those relationships clear very, very early in an ongoing basis. I just wanted to say also that we have what's called a Just Fixes program, and one of those Just Fixes sets of work is to help people to navigate what can often be a very unfriendly, patriarchal kind of environment. And whatever the situation is that's required before, during, and after a disaster, we've got to be able to help people to be assertive, to be moving through those systems, whether they are state systems or non-state systems, and help that to happen. So I think I'll end there. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Nolly. So, Rosemary, would you like to add anything?
I suppose, Nolene's really put some powerful framing to it, but I suppose coming from my position with the committee, I bring it back to the fact that our normative framework has to change. We think in a very narrow normative framework, what is, the human condition, where the human condition is an infinitely variable aspect. So we need to broaden that normative framework. We always start from this very narrow concept of the human norm, and we build policy around that, and we need to break beyond that. The convention, being the first human rights convention for the 21st century, takes a much more intersectional approach and recognises the multiple layers of identities that people experience and have. that have, and the experiences that leads to in their dynamic relationship with the social structures around us. And so it's with that kind of breaking of this very narrow norm that we'll be able to bring more people into the power structure and break those traditional power relationships that keep people isolated and excluded from participating within society.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Rose. We were really, really thoughtful, I think. It's now my pleasure to call on Jasmine Hayden and Ariella Mangan to ask our fourth question.
Hello, my name is Jasmine and this is Ariella. We are both 12 years old and in Year 6 at St Joseph's Catholic Primary School in Woodburn, Northern New South Wales. Both of us and half the students and staff at our school lost our homes in the flood. We lost our school, we lost our church. We've all had to move to another town, to temporary housing and a temporary school. We've also lost our connection to the community.
We are often told by adults that our voice is important, our experience is valuable, and that we can be the change that the future needs. If this is true, how is our voice and experience going to be authentically and actively sought out and included when preparing for the disasters that we know are likely to come and impact our future? How are you going to empower us to be the change that the future needs? Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Jasmine and Ariella. It really does me some good to see younger people included in a conference like this. All too often we don't hear from you, so this is kind of a special moment, I think, for all of us. Look, for those, just as a bit of background, because we have just a moment or two here, the floods in Lismore that have affected the community were completely unprecedented in terms of Australian conditions. This was so outside the envelope of our lived experience that it was truly shocking and had an unprecedented and ongoing impact on a very substantial community in Australia. So we're talking here about an event of such magnitude. We're still coming to grips with it, I think. So in that sense, could I turn to you, Sudirman, to just ask you how you might answer that question?
Thank you for the very inspiring question. So from our experience and lesson learned in Indonesia, youth community has always been the main resources of activism that transformed the nation from the beginning. So related to the disaster risk reduction, most of Indonesian Red Cross volunteers and activists has been involved from a very young age of the high school when they joined Youth Red Cross, what we call Palang Merah Remaja. Most of them then become prominent Indonesian Red Cross leaders, and even if they are not joining the organization, they become prominent philanthropists and strong supporters of the organization. However, now we are facing a new challenges. I remember vividly that there are the era where gaming technology was not as developed as today. Joining Youth Red Cross and Boy Scout at that time was very popular choice among them. But today, the youth had too many choices and distractions. It is indeed a great challenge for all the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement around the globe to develop a youth program that attracts the interest of young generation. I would like to propose that my colleagues in Red Cross and Red Crescent movement establish a youth program that can relate and promote the connection to the Z generation. The organization could also assist and facilitate them with youth forum, which serve as a form of or avenue for developing their leadership path and journey. not only in the movement, but beyond that, they can capitalize their experience for the leadership role in public and corporate sectors. That way, we actually develop what we call as three-sector athletes, the leaders who are exposed to the three sectors: public, corporate, and also social movement. Finally, I would like to call all the leaders of the movement across the Asia-Pacific to strengthen the Asia-Pacific Youth Connection by organizing youth forum and event parallel to our regular event like APM CDRR. Providing youth with such forum is a strong signal for sustainability of disaster risk reduction effort.
Great, thank you so much, Sudirman, for that. I think it's an offer that we'll look forward to being taken up. So, Ricardo, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that young generations are facing really unprecedented challenges in the history of our planet. And I have to confess, I am the grandfather of two little children, and I really think, now more consciously about what we making decisions now are potentially affecting the lives of future generations. So this is, of course, a matter that is very important and needs to be taken very seriously, particularly as I said, these unprecedented challenges that we are facing now. And we need to find ways to co-create innovative solutions, drawing on the capacities, knowledge, enthusiasm, skills, energy, and experiences of young people. But how do we do that? And I think that was a good point that was raised by our two representatives of youth here. Well, the UN is moving forward with what we call the UN Youth 2030 strategy, which is working with and for young people, promoting and creating an enabling environment for youth people's important and positive contribution to disaster risk reduction and other areas. We at UNDRR, we work hard to ensure that there is participation by children and youth in the events that we organize around the globe, both in our global platforms, as was the case in the Bali Global Platform last month of May, but also in our regional platforms, similar to the APM-CDRR in other regions, actually dedicating even preparatory meetings and youth forums around these initiatives to ensure that there is true inclusion and participation of youth in our meetings and the meetings that we organize. We strongly engage with the stakeholder group of children and youth also to work together with them on making sure that there are spaces and an enabling environment for youth to participate in our events. And we have seen that youth are actually leading climate action, for example, around the world. And they are shifting the perspectives of many adults, me included, and putting political pressure for increased prioritization of climate and disaster action in many countries. And we see that these movements are starting to multiply themselves and flourish. We have things like the Extinction Rebellion and many others, and youth are participating very, very actively and committedly in all these movements. So we need to focus on three areas from our perspective. One is to building capacity and enhancing risk understanding to build resilience and reduce risk. Two, empowering youth to drive innovation and novel communication to enhance the implementation of the Sendai framework. And finally, support youth leaders on DRR advocacy and action. I think that's very, very important.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Can I say, we often, as we go about our daily work, forget that the eyes of the future generation are on us, and they can often see simple solutions where all we see is complexity and problems. I remember I was in Scotland in the lead up to the Glasgow climate meeting, and a youth group there was asked to deliberate on what to do about plastic pollution. And they said, it's simple, just ban single-use plastic bags. And all the adults in the room took a gulp, but then realised actually that was the answer. So young people have a huge amount to contribute, in my view, to this issue. But thank you. We should now move on to question 5. I'd like to call on Warita Wanatong, who is the Urban Governance Specialist at the Asian Disaster Preparedness Centre, to ask her question.
Funding is always the elephant in the room. Localized approach to disaster preparedness are often tied to government funding and grants that have short time frames, often only 2 or 3 years, which not allow for programs and initiatives to take root and build momentum. What steps can we take to achieve government funding so that it adopts a longer-term model? Or is the private sector better suited to this type of funding model?
Thank you. Perhaps we could first turn to you, Ricardo, to answer that one.
Sure, and thank you very much for that question, which I believe it's very important. In reality, sustainability and resilience are two sides of the same coin. To ensure investments are sustainable, they need to be risk-informed. Otherwise, we'll continue in this spiral of creating new risks, and we will have to pay later on. Currently, DRR investments are far from being enough. And unfortunately, how overseas development assistance works currently, from $100 of ODA, overseas development assistance, between 2010 and 2018, as little as 47 cents were allocated to disaster risk reduction, and even less than that targeting local level approaches. So we cannot continue with this situation. If we continue with business as usual, we will continue increasing risks and not meeting the objectives of the Sendai framework. So governments are not prioritizing DRR investments as they should. And sometimes it's because the decision-making of politicians is very short-sighted, and they see it as a cost, not as an investment. And sometimes, say, well, what are the probabilities of me, while in office, to face a disaster situation in my 4 or 5 years when I'm going to be in office? And of course, the odds may be low, and that's why politicians decide potentially, okay, so it's not going to happen to me, maybe it happens to the next person in office, so I'm not going to prioritize this. And this is understandable sometimes because there are a lot of pressures on many areas that need public funding and investment to progress. But I think that we have to change this way of thinking and this short-sightedness of the political decision-making processes. Politicians many times, and I'm sorry if there are many politicians in the room, but sometimes decisions are made based on polls and what is going to bring some political profitability, let's say, and looking into the next election, instead of looking on what can be done in the long term to make sure that we have resilient communities and that we are indeed putting the money where it's really needed. So we need to change that. We have to actually, when we talk about disaster risk reduction, we have to think more about long term. And I agree in the sense that, if you do an investment now and 20 years down the road, thanks to that investment, you have prevented the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people, nobody is going to thank you for that because, 20 years later, who will remember that? But indeed, this is the type of thinking that we need, because to reduce disaster risk, it takes time. One, to reduce the risk that we have already built, which is enormous. And secondly, and it's easier and politically potentially more feasible, to make sure that every investment that we do today is risk-informed. Because, as I said, otherwise this spiral of building risk is not going to end. And this is happening similarly, more or less, with the capital market investments that are not accounting for disaster risks and are, in essence, bankrolling future disasters. And there is, in the private sector, a bit of a misperception that DRR is the sole responsibility of the public sector. And that's indeed not the case, as we know. So the true cost of disasters is still external to private sector investment decision making. We need to include these costs and benefits in financial modeling and, thank you, and disclose risk in balance sheets. Otherwise, if we are not able to price risk appropriately also, private sector will continue doing what they are currently doing, although we know that there is a growing level of awareness on the private sector also, and mainly because of the frequency and intensity in which disasters are occurring now, and that are having a great impact on supply chains and production places that are really hitting the private sector very badly. So this is helping in changing this type of mindset. So I think that we need to ensure that longer-term DRR financing is available at community levels. This is fundamentally important, and particularly, as I said, avoid creating new risks.
Great. Thanks, Ricardo. Nolene, would you have anything to add to that?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. I mean, for feminist groups around the world, but for so many people's movements, for many governments now, this is about financing for development. It is about Addis Ababa. It is about the entire kind of commodification and marketization of governance, and the fact that we have to struggle against that and to keep putting forward the fact that states are duty bearers. But as you're rightly pointing out, that we've got to be thinking about this, not just about reconfiguration of states, but about holding corporations accountable for what it is they are doing at the smallest ecosystem level and at the ecospheric level. I mean, we're in big trouble. We have 200 species a day that are going extinct. We have 70 to 80% of forests that are gone. We have 50% of the Great Barrier Reef that's under direct threat now. We, in the Pacific, have some of the last remaining healthy, and now we're not even sure if we can call it healthy tuna fisheries. And this is about being resilient. It is about whether we can maintain ourselves as individuals and as societies as we move forward into these really troubled times. And so when we're looking at issues of climate and disaster reduction and response, we've got to think about mitigation funding, but we've got to think about adaptation funding. And please, we have got to talk about loss and damage finance as separate over and above issues of mitigation and adaptation, and then again separate to what we require for disaster risk reduction. These are issues of finance, but please, let's be clear, these are also issues of sovereign debt and debt servicing, and whether or not we as peoples and as countries are able to put into our communities and into our infrastructure and into all of these reasons that we're here, whether or not we have the public finance to do that. And that's also about things like the international finance institutions like special drawing rights from the IMF and others. We've got to be able to have access to these things that we put into place decades ago. Surely all of the things that we're facing now on loss and damage and disasters, we've got to reconfigure our global financial structures and our processes. And I wanted to say, you know, just like climate justice, and we've all been talking about this now, disaster risk reduction is about a just response. We don't use the language of natural disasters, and we talked about this, that, you know, that there's a reason for that, because there is a direct cause. There's social, economic, and ecological decisions that are being made that are causing disasters. And there's a small group of extractivist carbon emitters and polluters who really are not helping the money to flow. And we still need to be clearer on that and what we're asking for. And I have to say, let's look at our political will and look about at the uneven responses that we have. If a disaster is in Pakistan, or if it's in Ukraine, or if it's in Palestine, or West Papua, or in Puerto Rico, the amount of media coverage that we get, the amount of resources that goes into it, the amount of political will. It's incredibly important that we talk about the geopolitics of disaster risk reduction and response, just as for climate response. And I just wanted to say then, back at the national level, we have to talk about gender responsive budgeting and make sure that we're tagging human rights and gender spending accurately, and that we don't rely always on gender ministries, for instance, to do all of the work on gender, but that we're always connecting and communicating and making sure that those resources are going both to gender machineries, which are often the most underfunded ministries, we all know that, but secondly, that the money goes to local autonomous women-led and people-led movements, because that's where the real struggle and the solutions are coming from. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nolene. I'd now like to call on Rodora Claseo, who's the Municipal Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Officer from the municipality of Vincennes in the Philippines, to ask the sixth question.
Thank you, Professor Tim. Good morning, distinguished panelists. This is my question. What are the mechanisms you have been utilizing in your country and across your communities to educate and capacitate your citizens in disaster risk reduction? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps you could begin, Sudirman, on this one.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the question. So Indonesia is located in the equatorial region, which is inseparable to hydrometeorological disaster. In 2020 alone, PNPB, the National Agency for Disaster, reported that 90% of more than 5,000 disasters are related to hydrometeorological, with flood as the majority among the 10 typical disasters. As we remember, the mega thrust earthquake that created a massive tsunami in Aceh have changed our perspective on disaster. It is no longer an event considered far away, but really close to our everyday life. It could happen anytime, and the impact could not be measured. The disaster impact is enormous, and the cost to recover is profoundly huge. It needs collaboration from all the stakeholders, from the government, civil society, and also business community. In Aceh, the global community play a significant role in recovery and reconstruction post-disaster. I remember the number of the international organizations work in Aceh at that time. It's 782. That was the first workshop I ran at that time, including donors, NGOs, UN agencies, and also Red Cross and Red Crescent community from all over the world. One important lesson that we learned from Aceh was the importance of strengthening the community awareness and knowledge about disaster risk reduction. One of the Indonesian Red Cross mandate is to continuously strengthen and building the spirit of volunteerism. PMI has allocated significant resources for public education, at least at 3 levels. At the community level, we assist the community to construct their internal systems in managing risks, get going to know the risks, and how to evaluate the risk reduction measures have been taken. At the school level, we assist the schools in creating environment which contributing to create youth as agent of changes on disaster preparedness and risk reduction. In addition to improve education and learning facilities to be more resilient to the disaster. And at the family level, this is very important one. As the smallest social unit in the community, family has roles in each emergency situation and must be present anytime. PMI aims at least one person in the family have the basic understanding on disaster preparedness and risk reduction. Finally, I would like to emphasize that it is imperative to invest more in human capital. I strongly suggest that all actors invest aggressively, allocating significant amount of resources for human capital development. That investment should include massive public and youth education, including corporate sectors. The Indonesian Red Cross has just signed an agreement with the Ministry of Labor, just before I left in Jakarta, to promote what we call as disaster resilient corporation. We do believe that all initiatives are equally important so that we could improve the knowledge and disaster adaptive capacity to our community in Asia Pacific region. Thus, in the near future, we would like have a stronger and more resilient community.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Sudirman. Rosemary, would you like to add anything to that question?
I suppose on a much broader scale, my community with the committee is the community of nations, and I suppose the work that we've been doing is about educating states in some ways about their obligations under human rights law. The Convention has a dedicated substantive article around disaster risk reduction. It places obligations on states to address the situations of risk and emergency for people with disabilities and to ensure that their human rights are upheld during times of emergency and that they are protected during, that plans and mitigation strategies are put in place that they're protected during times of risk. We've seen time and time again that people with disabilities are not included in disaster risk reduction. There's clear connections that we see between the pandemic, the situation in Ukraine, the current situation in Pakistan with the floods from climate change, and time again it's that there isn't the role of people with disability in planning and recovery. There isn't communication with the community of people with disability, and so not only are people being left out of critical information, they are then not getting access to critical equipment or critical paths of safety and mechanisms of safety. If they do reach safe havens, and if they're in third-party states, then they're not accessible, the processes aren't accessible, there aren't mechanisms by which them to be able to seek accommodation of their needs, to be able to be able to be supported in a way that is required to keep them safe. And so the work that we've been doing is trying to highlight the risk to people with disability, but also to set out the principles and standards by which states should be addressing disaster risk reduction. And so with that, the committee has done a lot of focus in terms of making sure that when we engage with states in their review process and our constructive dialogues with states, that we talk to them about how they include people with disabilities in disaster risk reduction planning, how people with disabilities have been included in response and recovery planning. We also have held, a special session in the last committee session in August, September, where under our powers of the Convention, under Article 35, we asked states, parties involved in the Ukraine situation as receiving countries for people fleeing Ukraine, but also sought information from both the Russian Federation and the Ukrainians about the situation for people with disability in Ukraine. We sought that information. We discussed the opportunities to better protect people with disability, to make sure that they have access to humanitarian corridors, that there are mechanisms for them to be able to access critical medications and supports. And what it also highlighted was that the mechanisms and the infrastructure that are in place that exclude people with disability and isolate people with disability were the situations like in the pandemic that created the greatest risk. So institutionalisation of people with disability, the segregation of people with disability into congregate living situations, leave them at critical risk. In the pandemic, it was about the fact that institutions were petri dishes for the COVID to bubble away, and the risk of infection was heightened, triply so. But in conflict, what happens is people with disability in institutions are either abandoned in the institutions, or there's been the situation in Ukraine where they're being used as human shields, or they are sitting ducks to and targets for rockets and missiles. So it's been an incredibly connected set of emergency situations where the situation for people with disability is repeatedly the same, that they are excluded in the understanding of how people can be kept safe, and so they aren't kept safe. And so we released a report which was included in our session report on Ukraine. We looked at some of the critical things that have to happen immediately, and shorter and longer term issues that need to be addressed. The same with the Pakistan floods. We've done a joint statement with UNDRR and again looked at immediate responses, but also considered what needs to happen within a human rights framework for medium to long-term responses. And we will continue to do this to build the knowledge of states around the principles and standards in human rights that need to be observed in disaster risk reduction to ensure that everybody's safe.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. We now have a video question from Akanisi Latu, who's a small business entrepreneur from Fiji.
In my community in Fiji, the voice of people living with disability are finally being heard when it comes to disaster management planning. But change is slow, and we need better representation now. What role can the government and international government play to make sure we are being represented at all levels of disaster preparedness?
Great, thank you. Perhaps I could ask for responses first from Rosemary and then Nolene, but could I just mention we're running behind time a bit, so if we could be a bit succinct, that would be great. Thank you. So Rosemary, please.
States have an obligation under Section 4.3 of the Convention that they should closely consult and actively involve people with disabilities in the process of developing disaster risk reduction plans, response plans, recovery plans, that people with disabilities should be active partners in the process.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rosemary. That's great. Nolene?
I'll try and be that quick too. Examine the state of the state and be open to critique as governments on where you're not doing well. And that means things like, maybe placing a gender equality and social inclusion officer within the NDMO and giving them resources and support and power to move. Have a strong gender action plan and resource it, monitor it, and update it. And doing things like holding ministers and permanent secretaries accountable and being real on that, like making sure that you're putting into place things like targets, proper targets, capacity building opportunities, that proposing mentorship, having a pipeline and a gender expert roster that governments can call on, including women with disabilities, including people who are experts on SOGISEC, setting quotes for participation, roles on delegations, having both the numerical targets, but also the qualitative targets. What are we expecting from our governments to achieve? National committees that can help to verify whether or not they're doing that or not. And the last one I'd say is have a concrete Sendai gender plan for every country and have a disabilities and inclusion plan for every country. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those brilliant and very succinct answers. You've just about caught us up to time. It's wonderful. So look, I'd now like to call on James Gilling, First Assistant Secretary of the Humanitarian and Partnerships Division of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to ask the final question.
Yeah, thanks very much, panel. My question, I think, is a tactical question. We're on our way to New York, May next year. There are going to be high-level discussions there. We've heard a lot of really interesting insights into what needs to happen. But what's the number one priority for each of you about what this panel should focus on? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Perhaps we could start with Sudirman and then just work our way through.
Thank you. So the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement worldwide has been campaigning the importance of what we call localization policy. We have to remember the 4 main messages in this regard. Number 1 is prioritize the most vulnerable. Number 2 is promote locally led DRR action. And number 3, increase amount of accessibility to climate adaptation. And the 4th, scale up effective DRR action. I think if I have to put one priority is human capital development is the most important thing. And at PMI, we station all the volunteers is on the ground in a district level and village level. So I think Just for example, I have to mention that we have a protocol of 6-hour golden time. So within 6 hours, after disaster, the volunteers should be on the ground, doing the emergency response, providing food, drinking water, and clean water and temporary shelter, while doing assessment for longer-term recovery. This policy does work so far because we have volunteers on the ground. So I think with this lesson, I would propose that the priority should be on the human capital development, including the volunteerism. Thank you, Professor Robert.
Thank you, Nolan.
I'd say of all of the points, that the Sendai framework really needs a gender action plan, and it needs one that's incorporated into the current accountability frameworks, that's consistent, concise, and really helps towards a clear, prioritized gender and DRR work plan toward 2030. It needs to be transformative. It both needs to have specific goals on Sendai framework and gender and DRR, but it also needs to be coherent and integrated with national gender action plans, with the UNFCCC gap, and the Lima Extended Work Program, but also the Convention on Biodiversity, and the new goals, global goals for that go through to 2040. Because I think we're all very clear that we're nowhere near the 1.5 trajectory that we need to be on, and so any work in Sendai framework that can help us across coherent and consistent sets of work to 2030 and beyond is incredibly important right now. Thank you.
I might just ask Rosemary for her comments and give you the last place, Ricardo. Rosemary, do you have anything to add?
I suppose for me it would be that we learn the lessons from the last couple of big disaster situations, and that is that it highlighted the inequality and discrimination that lots of communities within our communities experience. So for people with disability, it highlighted that things like institutionalisation and segregation and other forms of social exclusion and discrimination were heightened risk factors for people in the pandemic and other disaster situations. So we need to be able to address that underlying inequality and discrimination. Nolene said it so powerfully that, disasters don't discriminate. Well, yes, they do, and they discriminate because there are pockets of people within our society that experience significant levels of inequality and discrimination, and that leaves them at risk. They are not inherently vulnerable in and of themselves. It's the inequality and discrimination that they face every day that leaves them vulnerable. And if we can address that, then we're in a much better situation to be able to address disasters and risks that we confront as a community.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. Ricardo, just your final thoughts?
Yes, in less than a minute, I hope.
Yes,
but in addition to agreeing with all the fellow panelists on their points, I think that, the midterm review of the Sendai framework offers a great opportunity to look at what needs to be done to ensure that by 2030 we will have achieved the different aspects of the Sendai framework. And we have discussed, we need to look at the outcome of the Sendai framework, the goal of the Sendai framework, the global targets of the Sendai framework with its 38 indicators. We have to look at the 4 priorities for action, but we also have to look into the guiding principles. And this is, I think, in my view, one aspect that has been overlooked the most. So I think that we need to put a greater emphasis on better understanding and better addressing the aspects that are considered under these guiding principles of the Sendai framework, which actually relate to many of the things that have been discussed today. Promoting and protecting all human rights, inclusive, accessible, and non-discriminatory participation, paying attention to people disproportionately affected by disasters, integrating a gender, age, disability, and culture perspective in all policies and practices, and promoting and supporting women and young leadership.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank all of you for such a fantastic panel. It's been wonderful. I'd just like to say I've learnt a lot today. I've learnt that real resilience builds from that local level, and that involving communities early and consistently and involving them holistically is just absolutely critical to getting an appropriate disaster response. I really hope that today's discussions left us all with a desire to help and accelerate implementation of the Sendai framework. And that we can go out of here now, I guess, with an inclusive, collaborative approach that we can promote in terms of disaster risk and hopefully go forward into a better future. The next conference session starts at 11 o'clock after morning tea, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.